The video you are about to watch will unravel one of the most terrifying and haunting chapters of history. In 1939, amidst the chaos of the Soviet invasion of Finland, a group of soldiers ventured into the infamous Mount Vottovaara, a place steeped in chilling legends of dark rituals and unspeakable horrors. What began as a routine military mission soon spiraled into a massacre that would leave no survivors. In the harsh and unforgiving landscape of Finland, where the air bites and the ground itself seems to groan beneath the weight of history, there exists a place few dare to speak of: Mount Vottovaara. A peak that has seen the rise and fall of empires, a mountain that has witnessed wars, legends, and secrets buried deep within its shadowed past. But as the Soviet forces began their invasion of Finland in 1939, they would come to understand that some battles are not fought with rifles and artillery alone. This is not a tale of soldiers facing an enemy they can see. This is not a tale of bullets and bombs. No. This is the tale of an invisible force, something that watched and waited, something that had been there long before the first soldiers set foot on its slopes. Through the fog, through the deep forests, the Soviet soldiers marched, unaware of the ancient presence that silently observed them, always just out of sight. It wasn't until they reached the summit that they realized they were no longer alone. Some say it was the mountain itself, an ancient place of power, its past imbued with energies no mortal can comprehend. Others claim it was the spirits of soldiers long dead, their voices lost to time, but still they linger, trapped in a place they can never leave. Whatever the truth, one thing became clear: those who dared to enter this cursed place would not leave the same. Or in some cases, not leave at all. On this mountain, the soldiers found themselves facing something beyond their understanding, a force that did not play by the rules of warfare. Their weapons would be useless here, their tactics irrelevant. What they were about to encounter was beyond anything they could have ever imagined. Late 1939. The Soviet forces, bolstered by numbers, pushed deep into Finnish territory, their sights set on strategic landmarks, among them the looming Mount Vottovaara, a peak that would soon become a symbol of death and despair. The soldiers marched, unaware of the darkness they were heading towards, a force more insidious than the one they had been sent to fight. To the Soviets, it was just another objective in a campaign of conquest. But for those who had crossed paths with the mountain before, there were whispers. Whispers of an ancient place that held its own secret history, far older and darker than the soldiers could comprehend. Before their ascent, seasoned officers, men who had seen the horrors of war, had heard the warnings passed on from local informants. Stories of ancient Sami rituals, rituals linked to the land, and tales of strange disappearances, too numerous to ignore. Soviet soldiers dismissed the warnings as nothing more than the ramblings of the superstitious. After all, what was there to fear from an old mountain, a peak marked by nothing more than cold winds and ancient trees? Little did they know the mountain was listening, and it would have its say soon enough. As the soldiers settled in for the night, far from the safety of their homeland, there were eyes upon them. Finnish scouts, men who had long learned to live with the quiet terror of the mountain, watched from the shadows. Hidden among the trees, their eyes fixed on the Russian soldiers, knowing what was to come, yet powerless to stop it. These Finnish soldiers knew something the Russians did not. They knew the mountain was not just a physical place. It was a vessel for something far older, a place where the past had a way of creeping into the present. The Russians, however, were oblivious, unaware that the very earth they stood on was watching, waiting. The Soviets had no idea they were being watched. They had no idea that the mountain's ancient curse would soon reveal itself. What they thought was a simple advance into enemy territory would soon become something far more dangerous, something they would not be able to fight, outrun, or escape. It was only a matter of time. And so, under the cover of darkness, the march toward the mountain continued. But the first signs of something unnatural were already beginning to take shape. It wasn't the soldiers who would determine the fate of the expedition, but something far beyond their understanding, something that had been waiting in the cold, silent wilderness for centuries. As the Soviet soldiers neared the base of Mount Vottovaara, the weight of the journey began to settle on them in ways they couldn't explain. The forest grew thicker, more oppressive, as if the very land itself was pushing back against their advance. The trees seemed to close in around them, blocking the horizon, leaving them in an endless sea of white. The further they climbed, the more it felt as though something unseen was keeping watch, waiting. The air around them grew heavier, almost stifling. With every step they took, the cold seemed to cut deeper into their bones. Their breath, once visible and crisp in the frigid air, now lingered as wisps of smoke, swallowed up by an unnatural stillness. The forest was silent, too silent. The occasional snap of a twig underfoot was amplified, echoing in their ears as if mocking their every movement. They were being watched. The soldiers couldn't explain it, but they could feel it in their very bones. It was more than just paranoia. It was a presence that seemed to hang in the air, pressing against them from all directions. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, sent their hearts racing. The shadows seemed deeper, the sounds of the forest more foreign, as if something or someone was keeping track of their every move. As they ascended, the temperature dropped sharply. It wasn't just the cold, they could feel the weight of the air, a thick, suffocating presence that pressed in from every side. The soldiers tried to keep moving, to push past the chill, but it seemed as though the cold itself had become a living thing, reaching out to paralyze them. It wasn't the kind of cold they were used to, it was something more invasive, as though it was seeping into their very skin, invading their senses. The silence was broken only by the crunch of boots on snow, the occasional murmur of a soldier, and the distant howling of the wind, though there was no sign of it where they stood. It was unnatural, unsettling. The soldiers' nerves began to fray. The ever-present feeling of being watched gnawed at their thoughts, impossible to shake. The familiar sounds of nature, birds, insects, had disappeared, leaving only the oppressive quiet. And then came the first disturbance. A shadow moved between the trees, fleeting, barely noticeable, but it was enough. A soldier, his heart hammering in his chest, quickly spun around, but no one was there. His eyes darted across the trees. Nothing. His breath quickened, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The others felt it too, the same unease, the same terror creeping into their minds. Something was wrong, but they couldn't place it. From the shadows, the Finnish scouts watched, their eyes narrowing as the Russians climbed higher. They had seen this before. The same unease, the same signs. It wasn't the cold, nor the forest, nor the isolation that was affecting the soldiers. It was the mountain itself. They knew what the Russians didn't, that the deeper one ventured into Vottovaara, the harder it became to escape its grasp. The closer they got to the summit, the closer they came to something no one could outrun. The Russians, caught in the grip of growing paranoia, pushed forward, each step heavier than the last. They didn't know it yet, but the mountain was pulling them in, closer to its heart, where they would face something they could neither see nor fight. The land itself had marked them, and it wouldn't let them go. As the first light of dawn broke over the snow-capped peaks, the Soviet soldiers reached their objective, the summit of Mount Vottovaara. It was a place they had fought so hard to reach, a strategic vantage point that would grant them control over the surrounding area. But instead of victory, they were greeted with something else, a profound and unnatural stillness that seemed to settle over the mountain. The weight of the silence was suffocating. The forest, once alive with sounds of nature, had fallen eerily quiet. Even the wind had ceased, as though the mountain itself had suspended time, waiting. Here at the mountain's peak, something felt wrong. The very air was thick, pressing in on the soldiers, causing them to look over their shoulders with increasing frequency. The twisted trees, the jagged stone structures. These were not the natural features they expected. The soldiers set up camp in a tense, mechanical fashion, their movements growing more sluggish as they navigated through the increasingly bizarre landscape. What they thought would be a temporary halt before moving further now felt like a place they might not leave so easily. As night fell, the campfire became the only source of comfort. The soldiers gathered around, their voices hushed as they exchanged uneasy glances. The air had become thick with tension, their conversation laced with nerves. One soldier, his eyes darting into the surrounding darkness, spoke in a low voice, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Did you hear that? Whispers in the wind, faint like someone calling out to us. Probably just the trees groaning from the cold." Despite the reassurances, doubt lingered in the air. The sounds that had unsettled them earlier now felt more deliberate, more intentional. Every rustle of the trees, every groan of the mountain beneath their feet, seemed to carry with it the weight of an invisible presence. It wasn't just the harsh elements, nor was it the strain of the journey that had them on edge. It was something else entirely, something that none of them could put into words. Tensions among the soldiers rose as they began to argue over trivial matters, each projecting their own fears onto others. No one spoke openly about the unease that gripped them, but it was there, hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. Fear began to take root. The soldiers, typically hardened men accustomed to the horrors of war, could not escape the growing sense that they were not alone. The whispering wind had become louder now, as though it carried messages they couldn't hear but somehow understood. In the growing darkness, their fears took shape. Shadows in the trees, flickers of movement just beyond the reach of the firelight. Every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified as if the mountain itself was listening. Silence shattered abruptly, a snap in the darkness just outside their camp. Every soldier's instinct screamed, something was there. One soldier, his heart racing, stood frozen as his rifle pointed toward the darkened forest. The movement he had seen was fleeting, too quick to be sure of its source, but it was enough. The tension that had been building reached a breaking point, and in that instant, everything erupted. In a desperate attempt to defend themselves, a soldier fired into the trees. The echo of the shot reverberated through the mountain, and with it, a chain reaction, gunfire erupted from all sides. The soldiers' rifles cracked against the silence, their fingers trembling as they squeezed the triggers. But the night, the mountain, the eerie stillness, they offered no answers, only more confusion, more fear. Was it the enemy? Were they under attack? Or had something else stirred within the dark woods? Whatever it was, it made no reply. It simply watched, waiting as the soldiers' desperation turned to madness. One soldier collapsed, clutching his chest. Blood soaked through his uniform as he struggled to breathe. No shot had struck him. It wasn't the enemy. The others continued firing into the night, but their aim was unfocused. Panic had consumed them. In the flickering firelight, the camp became a chaotic mess of shouting men and empty gunshots. No one could explain what was happening, no one could stop it. From their distant positions, the Finnish scouts could hear the escalating chaos. The echoes of gunfire reverberated across the mountain, followed by screams, desperate, agonized cries that filled the air. Their expressions were grim, knowing what had been unleashed. They had long feared that the mountain's dark history was more than just a legend, and now, they could only listen in silence as the Russians fought against an invisible enemy. All of a sudden, one soldier screamed, "They're out there! They're out there! We're not alone!" As the fear spread, one soldier stumbled back from the camp's perimeter, his eyes wide with terror. His voice cracked as he shouted, "There were more. They weren't alone. But who were they? What were they fighting against?" No answers came, only the sounds of fear and confusion. Then, in a moment of eerie stillness, it was over. The shots stopped. The camp fell silent. The following morning, the mountain offered its chilling truth. The Soviet soldiers, once a force feared across battlefields, now lay as still as the very landscape they had once sought to dominate. Their bodies were scattered across the summit, abandoned in place as if their very souls had been torn from them, leaving nothing behind but the unmistakable imprint of death. Faces locked in expressions of terror, hands still gripping weapons as if to defend against an enemy that no one could see. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, stared into the empty expanse, as though seeking something beyond the horizon that they would never reach. As the Finnish scouts closed in on the bodies, they saw that there were no visible signs of violence. No wounds, no blood, no physical mark to indicate how the soldiers had met their end. It was as though death had simply claimed them without lifting a finger. And yet, their faces, the sheer terror etched into their expressions, something had broken them from within. Whatever it was, it left no physical trace, only a lingering sense of dread that seemed to pervade the air itself. One of the scouts crouched near the body, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the lifeless soldier. His fingers brushed against the frozen skin as cold as the mountain itself. He recoiled, not from the physical touch, but from the sensation that something more had claimed the man's life. Something beyond the reach of man's understanding. The air itself seemed to freeze even further, as if the mountain was watching them, waiting for them to make sense of the impossible. Could it be the mountain's spirits? The old stories, they warned of something that lived here. Spirits? Or could it be something else? Something deeper? Something inside them? Their own fears? Could it have consumed them? The scouts exchanged uncertain looks, each of them grasping for answers that slipped further away with every passing moment. The stories of old, the tales whispered among the locals, the warnings of an ancient presence that held dominion over the land, suddenly felt all too real. But was it something supernatural that had taken these men? Or had their own minds turned against them, consumed by terror so intense that it drove them to death without leaving a single mark on their bodies? Was it mass hysteria, a psychosis that spread like wildfire among the soldiers, breaking them down one by one until there was nothing left but their shattered minds? Or was it the mountain itself, its dark, hidden power, manifesting in ways that no one had ever imagined? Each scout grappled with the same question, but no answers came. Just more silence. The soldiers, unable to defend against an enemy they couldn't see or understand, had become victims of something far more insidious. The mountain, once a mere obstacle in their path, had become the harbinger of their undoing. The scouts sat in uneasy silence, the fire crackling between them. The bodies of the Soviet soldiers lay still on the mountain, untouched by time or nature. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. Anything. But the longer the scouts sat there, the more they understood that the mountain offered no answers. It only took, without warning, without mercy. The question now was not how these men had died, but why had they been chosen? Why here? Why now? And more chillingly, what came next? Mount Vottovaara is no ordinary mountain. To those who have ventured close, it is something more, an entity unto itself, bound not by the rules of nature, but by the unseen forces that haunt it. The fate of the Soviet soldiers, those men who came with certainty, with purpose, only to be undone by a force that they could neither comprehend nor confront, speaks to something far beyond our understanding. The mountain, with its twisted trees and strange stone formations, stands as an unforgiving monument to the unknown. It is a place where reality falters and the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, where silence reigns but its weight is not empty. There is an ancient, suffocating presence here, one that knows no forgiveness and leaves no explanation. The scouts, seasoned men who had long been familiar with the terrain and the whispers that surrounded it, could not shake the feeling that the mountain had taken something from them, something more than the soldiers' lives. They knew the old legends, of course, the tales of spirits that guarded the peak, the stories of disappearances that had no logical explanation. But they had always treated those stories with skepticism, dismissing them as mere folklore. Yet now, as they packed up and prepared to leave, they understood the weight of those words in ways they never had before. The mountain was not just a place to cross, it was a place that commanded respect, a place that would not simply allow anyone to pass without consequence. The Soviets who had come in force, believing their strength would carry them through, were gone, their bodies laying on the summit, claiming no victory, no glory. Only silence, only fear. We should never have come here. We should never have tempted it. One soldier said, though the scouts had witnessed what had happened to the Soviet soldiers, they too were left with questions that had no answers. They did not speak of it among themselves, not even when the last of the campfire embers had died out and the chill of night began to creep in. The mountain's grip on them was not physical. It was something deeper, something primal that lingered in the back of their minds. They knew that leaving did not mean escaping. Not entirely. The mountain was still there, still watching, still waiting for those who dared challenge it. The air was heavy as they made their descent, the land around them stark and unforgiving, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the snow, as if they too were trying to reach out and claim them. What had been left behind was not merely the bodies of the dead, it was the mountain's eternal witness to those who perished in its shadow. And as the scouts left, they carried with them the truth of something much older than war, older than any man or army. Something that would never allow itself to be forgotten. Today, Mount Vottovaara remains a place where the past refuses to release its grip. Local legend still whispers of the mountain's ancient curse, of the spirits that linger within its twisted forests and stones. Some say it is the weight of history, the legacy of wars fought and lives lost, that has left an indelible mark on the land. Others speak of a darker force, an ancient power that chooses who is allowed to leave and who will never return. Those who have ventured close speak of an oppressive presence, an unseen hand that grips the heart with dread. And those who return, if they return at all, are forever changed. Some forces, it seems, are not meant to be understood. Some places, once seen, can never be forgotten. Mount Vadara stands as a testament to the unknown, a place where those who have crossed it have vanished from memory, leaving only whispers behind. Its truth, whatever it may be, remains forever hidden in the cold, silent embrace of the mountain.